On September 19, 2021, in a remote stretch of Wyoming wilderness called Spread Creek, a travel blogger's body was found. She had been there for weeks. Her name was Gabrielle Petito, 22 years old, and by the time anyone discovered her remains beneath the sparse sage and windswept grass, the man she'd been traveling with had already returned home to Florida without her, driving her white Ford Transit van across state lines, saying nothing to her parents who had been calling, texting, begging for answers. He would never speak to police. Within days of her body's discovery, he would vanish into a swamp. But before any of that, before the search parties and the missing person posters and the breathless cable news coverage, there were two young people in love, or what looked like love, setting out on an adventure that would be documented in carefully filtered photographs and cheerful video montages. The trip began in early July, leaving from Northport, Florida. Gabby had been living with Brian Landry, her fiancé, at his parents' house. They had known each other since high school, an on-and-off relationship that had recently solidified into an engagement. Now they were embarking on what Gabby called their van life journey in a converted white Ford Transit. She had been building a following on Instagram and YouTube under the username Nomadic Static, posting images of herself in sun-drenched landscapes, barefoot in wildflower fields, standing before vast canyon vistas with her arms spread wide. The aesthetic was deliberate, aspirational, the kind of content that makes people double tap and dream of escaping their own ordinary lives. Brian, 23, was less visible in the posts, often behind the camera, occasionally appearing in shots where he looked somewhat reluctant, his energy more subdued than hers. They drove west through Kansas and Colorado, stopping at national parks and camping areas, Monument Rocks in Kansas, the painted deserts of Utah, the red stone formations that look like cathedrals built by wind and time. Gabby posted regularly, her feed filling with images that suggested joy, adventure, two people in love exploring the country together. But social media is a curated space, a highlight reel, and what happened between the posts, in the long stretches of highway driving and the cramped quarters of the van at night, remained unseen. Friends and family would later say that Gabby had mentioned arguments, that things weren't always smooth between them, but nothing that seemed alarming at the time. Young couples fight. Traveling together in close quarters is stressful. These were the explanations people gave themselves. By early August, they were in Utah, moving through Arches National Park and the tourist town of Moab, a place where adventure seekers and outdoor enthusiasts gather, where the desert heat presses down on everything by midday and the nights cool off under brilliant star fields. They checked into a hotel briefly, then returned to camping, moving between locations, updating social media sporadically. Gabby called her mother regularly, almost daily, video calls where she showed her mum the places they were seeing. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, would later say that Gabby seemed fine during these calls, excited about the trip, though perhaps a little tired. There was no indication that anything was seriously wrong, no indication that time was running out. On August 12th, something happened that should have changed everything. A witness called 911 in Moab that afternoon, reporting that they had seen a man slapping a woman near a food co-op, that the couple had then gotten into a white van with Florida plates and driven away. Officers from the Moab City Police Department located the van a short time later, pulling it over on the side of the highway. What followed was an hour-long interaction captured on body camera footage that would later be analyzed frame by frame, scrutinized for what the officers saw and didn't see, the decisions they made that allowed the couple to separate for the night, but ultimately sent them back on the road together. Gabby was crying when the officer approached, visibly distressed, her hands shaking, apologizing repeatedly. She said she had been struggling with her mental health, that she had OCD and anxiety, that she and Brian had been fighting about small things, that she had hit him first, that it was her fault. Brian was calmer, more composed, with scratches visible on his face and arms that he said came from her. He explained that they had been arguing about time management, about her spending too long working on her social media posts, about the stress of being together constantly in the van. The officers separated them, talking to each individually, trying to determine what had happened, who was the aggressor, whether anyone needed to be arrested. The witness had described seeing Brian slapping Gabby, but both Gabby and Brian told a different story, one where she was the primary aggressor, where he was defending himself, where the scratches on his face proved he was the victim. The officers consulted with each other, reviewed Utah's domestic violence laws, and ultimately determined that if anyone should be charged, it would be Gabby, though they decided not to arrest her, treating the situation instead as a mental health crisis, a bad day, a couple who needed to cool off. They arranged for the couple to spend the night apart. Brian in a hotel room paid for by the police department, Gabby in the van. The officers were friendly, sympathetic, treating both young people with apparent kindness, reassuring them that relationships are hard, that everyone fights, that they just needed some space and time to calm down. Before they parted ways, one officer gave Brian advice about how to handle things if Gabby got worked up again, suggesting he could walk away, take space, not engage with her anxiety. The body camera footage shows Gabby laughing at one point, seeming to relax, thanking the officers, apologizing for taking up their time. Brian appeared grateful, shaking hands with the officers, driving away in the van while Gabby waited for someone to take her to where she'd be staying that night. The incident was classified not as domestic violence but as a mental health crisis. The officers did their jobs according to how they understood the situation before them. They saw a young woman in distress, a young man with visible injuries, and they made the call that seemed most reasonable. They let them go. The footage would later be watched millions of times, every word analyzed, every gesture examined for hidden meaning, but in that moment it was just another call, another young couple fighting on a road trip, another situation resolved without arrest or further intervention. Gabby and Brian reunited the following day and continued their journey, posting again on social media, the images showing no trace of what had happened in Moab, just more sunsets, more landscapes, more of the carefully constructed narrative of adventure and freedom. By August 19th, they had checked into a hotel in Salt Lake City, the Fairfield Inn, where they spent several days. Gabby posted from there images that showed her smiling, captions about grateful hearts and beautiful places. On August 24th, witnesses would later report seeing the couple's van at a restaurant in Jackson, Wyoming, a mountain town that serves as a gateway to Grand Teton National Park. There was an incident at the restaurant, something about a dispute over the bill, raised voices, tension that other diners noticed. The next day, August 25th, Gabby's last Instagram post appeared, a photo of her standing before a colorful butterfly mural in Ogden, Utah, her hands forming a heart shape. The caption read simply, "Happy Halloween." It was still August. The holiday was months away. The post felt off somehow, disconnected, though no one looking at it then could have known why. That same day, Gabby's mother received a text from her daughter's phone. It said she was in Yosemite, heading to the park with no cell service. But something about the text bothered Nicole Schmidt. The phrasing seemed odd, not quite like how Gabby normally communicated, and Yosemite was in California, hundreds of miles from where Gabby had last said they were going. The text felt wrong, but not wrong enough to immediately panic. Not yet. On August 30th, another text arrived from Gabby's phone, just 2 words, "No service." It would be the last communication Nicole Schmidt received from her daughter's number. She tried calling. The phone went straight to voicemail. She tried texting. No response. Days passed with no word, and the silence began to feel less like poor cell reception, and more like something else entirely, something that made her stomach tighten with fear she couldn't yet name. On September 1st, 2021, Brian Laundrie arrived back at his parents' house in Northport, Florida, driving Gabby's white Ford Transit van. He arrived alone. Gabby was not with him. Her parents did not know he had returned. They did not know their daughter was missing. They were still trying to reach her, still sending texts that went unanswered, still calling a phone that rang and rang before going to voicemail. Brian said nothing to them. He did not call to explain where Gabby was or why he had driven her van across the country without her. He simply returned home, pulled into the driveway, and went inside his parents' house as if nothing unusual had happened. For 10 days, the Petito and Schmidt families tried to get answers. They called Brian's parents. They sent texts. They pleaded for any information about where Gabby might be, when anyone had last seen her, what had happened on the trip. The Laundrie family did not respond. Their attorney, Stephen Bertolino, released a brief statement advising them not to speak. The silence was maddening, incomprehensible. How could you not tell someone their daughter is missing? How could you say nothing when parents are desperate for any word, any clue, any shred of information? The Laundries stayed inside their home, curtains drawn, saying nothing to the frantic families trying to locate Gabby, nothing to the neighbors who began to notice the tension, nothing to anyone. On September 11th, Gabby's mother filed an official missing person report with the Northport Police Department. Gabby Petito, 22 years old, last known to be traveling in Wyoming, not heard from since late August, traveling with her fiancé, who had since returned home without her, and refused to say where she was. The case was assigned to investigators. They went to the Laundrie home to speak with Brian. He refused to talk. His parents refused to let him talk. Their attorney said his clients would not be making any statements. The police had no legal grounds to compel him. He was not under arrest. He had not been charged with anything. He had the right to remain silent, and he exercised that right completely. The story began to spread. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national media. A young woman missing, last seen with her fiancé. The fiancé now home refusing to speak, driving her van, living in his parents' house while her family begged for answers. The case had elements that captured attention: the photogenic young couple, the Instagram account full of beautiful images, the cross-country adventure turned nightmare, the boyfriend who wouldn't talk. People began following the case obsessively, amateur sleuths combing through Gabby's social media posts looking for clues, analyzing every photo for signs of distress, every caption for hidden meanings. TikTok users started posting theories, Facebook groups formed. The case became a phenomenon, something beyond a typical missing person investigation, something that gripped public attention in a way that felt both understandable and unsettling. On September 14th, investigators announced they were searching for Gabby in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, focusing their efforts on the area around Spread Creek. They had tracked the couple's movements through cell phone data, credit card transactions, and eyewitness reports. Multiple people had reported seeing the white Ford Transit van parked near Spread Creek in late August. The area was remote, miles from the main road, accessible only by rough dirt paths. Search teams began combing the sagebrush and sparse vegetation, looking for any sign of Gabby, any indication of what had happened in those final days of August when the communication stopped. Meanwhile, back in Florida, something else was happening. On September 14th, the same day search teams were scouring Wyoming wilderness, Brian Laundrie's parents reported that they hadn't seen their son since September 14th. They said he had told them he was going hiking in the Carlton Reserve, a 25,000-acre wilderness area near their home, a swampy expanse of trails and wetlands and alligator-infested waters. He had taken only a backpack. He had not returned. Now both Gabby and Brian were missing, though the circumstances could not have been more different. One disappeared in Wyoming while traveling with someone who refused to explain what happened. The other disappeared from his parents' home while under intense public scrutiny and media attention, while police were trying to speak with him, while the entire country was asking what he knew about Gabby's disappearance. On September 19, 2021, the search in Wyoming came to an end. Human remains were discovered in the Spread Creek dispersed camping area, in a location that matched descriptions from witnesses who had seen the white van parked there in late August. The body was found in an area not visible from the main paths, lying in the brush near a creek, a place where someone would have had to deliberately go, away from where casual hikers or campers would typically travel. The remains had been there for weeks, exposed to the elements, to wildlife, to the passage of time in a landscape that shows no mercy to what it holds. The identity had not yet been officially confirmed, but everyone already knew. The FBI's Denver division held a press conference. They were treating the area as a crime scene. The coroner was en route. Gabby's family would need to be notified officially once identification was complete. The confirmation came the following day. The Teton County coroner identified the remains as Gabrielle Petito. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. No further details were released about how she died, what injuries were present, how long she had been deceased before discovery. Those details would come later, after autopsy results were finalized, after evidence was processed and analyzed. But the essential truth was now established. Gabby Petito had not simply gone missing in the wilderness. She had not gotten lost or injured in an accident. Someone had killed her and left her body in a remote location in Wyoming, and the person who had been with her, who had driven her van back to Florida, who knew exactly when and where she had died, was now himself missing in a Florida swamp. The search for Brian Laundrie intensified. Dozens of law enforcement officers descended on the Carlton Reserve, wading through waist-deep water, navigating trails that flood seasonally, searching through vegetation so thick it requires machetes to cut through. Helicopters circled overhead. Drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the terrain. Bloodhounds tracked scents. The reserve is a hostile environment, home to alligators and venomous snakes, where temperatures climb into the 90s and humidity makes the air feel like breathing through wet cloth. If Brian Laundrie was out there with only a backpack, survival would be difficult. If he was trying to hide, the reserve offered endless places to disappear. If he had harmed himself, the swamp might never give up his body. The media coverage reached a fever pitch. Cable news ran near constant updates. Protesters gathered outside the Laundrie home, shouting at the closed windows, demanding answers, holding signs that read, "Where is Gabby?" even after Gabby had been found, even after everyone knew she was dead. The attention was unprecedented for a missing person case, raising questions about why this particular case captivated so many people when thousands of others go missing without generating headlines. Gabby was young, white, photogenic, with an active social media presence that made people feel they knew her. The circumstances were dramatic, the boyfriend's silence enraging, the social media trail providing a digital breadcrumb path that amateur detectives could follow. Other families with missing loved ones watched the coverage and wondered why their cases didn't receive the same attention, why their daughters and sons and siblings remained footnotes while Gabby Petito's name was spoken by millions. On September 23rd, the FBI issued a federal arrest warrant for Brian Laundrie. The charge was not murder, it was unauthorized use of a debit card. Investigators had determined that between August 30th and September 1st, someone had used Gabby's Capital One debit card to withdraw more than $1,000 from her account. The transactions occurred while Brian was driving the van from Wyoming back to Florida. The charge was a legal mechanism, a way to compel his arrest if located, a placeholder while the homicide investigation continued. It meant that now Brian Laundrie was not just a person of interest or someone refusing to cooperate. He was a federal fugitive, wanted on a warrant, subject to arrest on sight. The search of the Carlton Reserve continued day after day, finding nothing. No sign of Brian Laundrie, no evidence he had been there, no trace of the backpack or any belongings. His parents maintained they had last seen him on September 14th, that he said he was going hiking, that he had not returned. They joined search efforts briefly, walking trails with law enforcement, pointing out areas Brian liked to visit. The media captured footage of them, stone-faced and silent, escorted by police through the swampy terrain. They found nothing. Days became a week became 2. The reserve was searched and researched. Divers checked waterways, cadaver dogs worked the trails. On October 20th, more than a month after Brian Laundrie disappeared, his parents returned to the Carlton Reserve. They had been given permission by law enforcement to search an area that had previously been underwater, trails that had only recently become accessible as seasonal flooding receded. Chris and Roberta Laundrie walked into the reserve, accompanied by police, and within hours they found a white bag and a dark object that turned out to be a backpack. The items were in the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park, a section of the reserve Brian was known to frequent. Law enforcement moved in. Cadaver dogs were brought to the area. A short distance from where the belongings were found, human remains were discovered, partial skeletal remains. A notebook. The environment had been harsh, the water and wildlife and decomposition doing their work over weeks in the Florida heat and humidity. The FBI collected the remains and sent them for analysis. On October 21st, dental records confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were those of Brian Laundrie. He had been in the reserve the entire time, in an area that had been searched before but had been underwater, inaccessible until the water receded. The cause of death was later determined by the medical examiner to be a gunshot wound to the head. A revolver was found near the remains. The manner of death was ruled suicide. Brian Laundrie had walked into that swamp in mid-September and taken his own life, ending any possibility that he would ever answer questions about what happened to Gabby Petito, ever face charges, ever provide the closure that her family desperately needed. The notebook found with his remains was water-damaged, but the FBI was able to extract portions of what had been written. The contents were not immediately released to the public, but eventually details emerged. Brian had written about Gabby's death. He claimed he killed her to end her suffering, that she had been injured and in pain, that he had made a decision to end her life because he thought it was merciful. The claim was self-serving, a narrative that attempted to reframe murder as compassion, and it was contradicted by the autopsy findings. The Teton County coroner had determined that Gabby died by strangulation. She had been manually strangled, killed by compression of the neck, a method that takes sustained pressure, multiple minutes of deliberate action, not a split-second decision made in panic or mercy. Blunt force trauma to her head and face was also noted. These were not the injuries of someone who had been injured in an accident and put out of their misery. These were the injuries of violence, of rage, of someone who used their hands to take another person's life. The case would never go to trial. There would be no conviction, no sentencing, no public accounting of exactly what happened in those final moments in Wyoming. The only two people who knew the full truth were both dead, and one of them had left behind a self-justifying narrative that his own actions had already disproven. Gabby's family was left with questions that would never be answered, with gaps in the timeline that would never be filled, with the knowledge that their daughter's killer had escaped justice through death, that he would never sit in a courtroom and hear what he had done spoken aloud, never face Gabby's mother and father and siblings and explain why their daughter was gone. The public attention eventually faded. Other stories replaced this one in the news cycle. The protesters stopped gathering outside the Laundrie home. The social media groups moved on to other cases, other mysteries. But the underlying questions remained. What happened on August 12th in Moab, when police had both of them there, when they had documentation of a domestic incident, when they had a witness report of violence? Could different decisions have changed the outcome? Were there missed opportunities, signs that went unrecognized, moments when intervention might have altered the trajectory? The body camera footage remains available to watch, preserved forever, a document of a system that saw a young woman in distress and a young man with scratches and made determinations based on what they could see and measure, not on what might happen later in a remote campsite in Wyoming when no one else was watching. Gabby Petito's death became a cultural moment, a case that sparked conversations about domestic violence, about missing white woman syndrome, about social media and the curated lives people present versus the reality they experience. Her family established a foundation in her name to help other families searching for missing loved ones, to provide resources and support that they wished they had received sooner. The white Ford Transit van was eventually returned to Gabby's family. They sold it. The money went to the foundation. Somewhere in storage sit the journals and belongings that documented a young woman who wanted to share her adventures with the world, who had dreams of building something meaningful through travel and creativity, whose life ended at 22 in a place she had gone seeking beauty and freedom,